Morning, everyone. Thank you for dialing into the Red ZM Risk series. Today's session is all on the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. My name is Jen Corley. I'm the Strategic Execution Manager for Zurich Municipal, and today I'm joined by Phil Coley and Matt Hardwick from ZRS, who I will hand over in a moment to introduce themselves, but they'll be talking you through what the report means at both a global and a local level, putting a public sector lens on the report, which is, I'm sure, what you've all dialed in to hear today. Before we get into the session, just some housekeeping reminders from me. So we are recording a webinar this morning, and we will be able to share the link with you afterwards. And the link will also be available via YouTube. So we're not going to be sharing the slides, but if there is anything that you do want to go back to and to revisit, please do so via the recording. And I urge you all to use that recording and share it across your organisation as well. We are going to be having a 10-minute Q&A at the end of today's session. So if there is anything that you want more information on, or that you want to ask Phil, Matt or myself, please include your questions as we go throughout the session in the Q&A function. And just a reminder that Phil and Matt are the risk experts from ZRS here, so please ensure that your questions are risk-based or on the content of the report. So just before I hand over, just some final pointers from me as somebody who has used this report as both a risk manager and been on the other side of this webinar, and as somebody who has analysed it and presented on it previously. Whether this is your first time reading the report and you're unfamiliar with it, or it might actually be your 21st time, which I believe is what we're up to in terms of editions, this is useful and important risk management tool for engaging people in risk in your organisations. I think a lot of people feel that some of the risks, because they're at a global level, can feel quite irrelevant or quite far removed from their organisations, or can actually feel that they've read the same report and same information before, because it does feel quite similar to previous years. But just a reminder that actually the world that we're working in and the context has dramatically changed in the last 12 months. I did not expect to be using AI 3 or 4 times before I'd even had my first cup of tea this morning, and 12 months ago I couldn't imagine that. So please revisit some of the risks that Phil and Matt are going to be talking through today, and also share this really important information across your organisation. Share it with your risk networks, with your top table to engage in conversation. It's a really important tool to help you prioritise risk, which I know many of you sometimes struggle with. So with that, I shall hand over to Phil first, I believe, to kickstart us this morning.
Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you, and good morning to everyone on the call, and thank you for your time today. So yes, just as Jen has already said, the idea of our session is to talk around the Global Risk Report 2026 in general. So to give you some headlines, to give you the kind of main pointers, and also to think around what does this mean for the public sector. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Phil Coley, Principal Consultant. I've worked with Zurich for just over 25 years now, always in a capacity of looking at risk and resilience and business continuity, both working with Zurich customers such as yourselves, so absolutely working with public sector on building risk management frameworks and risk registers and risk strategies, but also working within the Zurich business itself as well. So I've spent a few years on the inside being a risk manager for Zurich. So I've come at this from both angles. Matt, who's going to speak after me, will perhaps introduce himself when he moves on to his session. So just to in terms of an agenda for this, a quick overview of the report itself, to give you an insight into some of the findings, and very importantly, to think around what does this mean for the public sector, and perhaps to think about some suggested next steps, kind of call to action at the end of the presentation. So just to set the scene for this, and I'm sure many of you on the call will be familiar with this report. It is annually produced by the World Economic Forum, and I'm old enough to remember that the first edition of this back in 2005, and I have to say back then the risks that were being described did feel at times to be a little bit distant, a bit way off, interesting, but I somehow felt a bit detached. I don't think you very much of risk topics that are raised. A lot of them feel very real, very live, very relevant, and are reflective of the world we are in. And of course, you only have to look at the news to see the risks that are being described being played out. So yes, a World Economic Forum document, essentially a survey, a global risk perception survey is sent round, and this time it was to over 1,300 global experts. That's actually gone up from 900 last year. So they are getting a wider group to input, and these are risk experts cutting across all sectors, all markets, and it is truly a global view. Looking at, yes, economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, technological. And interestingly, they look at the current climate, they look at and longer term. And that's really interesting because a lot of what this report does is about looking at trends, looking essentially horizon scanning. This report is not about identifying sort of an immediate event or something that's just about to hit. It is future thinking. It is saying, where is the world going? What are the risks we need to be aware of and plotting for, and having the actions required to address. Another really interesting thing around this report is the way in which it explores interconnections, interdependencies. And in a growing, complex, uncertain world, a global landscape that is ever more uncertain, I think that's also a really interesting piece to look at. A risk that might sit in one category may equally have consequences far beyond its own category. And I think the example we'll come back to, but it's just to pick one of those. If you look at climate as an example of that, the climate risk that's described, you can clearly see the interrelationship there between other types of risks, including economic and financial. So lots of interdependencies are highlighted. So key observations, and it's interesting when you look at this year's report, and as Jen has mentioned, if you looked at last year's report, there are, as you might expect, quite a lot of similarities. In some ways, this year's report is really just emphasizing trends, growing trends. So economic risks come out loud and clear, as you might expect. Economic downturn, inflation, asset bubble bursts, all of those factors are absolutely front and center of this year's report. Alongside that, technology, you perhaps won't be surprised. Misinformation and disinformation has always really been one that's been bubbling around in the risks report and is ever more prominent. But one that I particularly notice coming through, again, won't surprise, is AI technology risk. Yes, societal and political polarization. Again, I would say those are just intensifying, increasingly need to be considered. And interestingly, we'll come back to this, environmental risks, slightly deprioritized shorter term, but absolutely there in the longer term. And one real headline from this year's report is around geopolitical transformation, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The multipolar, fragmented world that we live in, and I suppose connected into that, protectionism, industrial policy, essentially countries drawing in within their borders, are more focused on their own individual needs and demands, as opposed to that broader global strategy. So those are some of the interesting observations from this year's report. And just to show you how they set it out. So in this year, so this is the world in 2026. And you can see here the top 10. There are actually 33 risk areas that are highlighted, but we've picked out the top 10. And as I said, the sort of headline news for this year is the rise in geo-economic confrontation. That's definitely moved up the chart from last year, increasingly as a global risk. Of course, we see that played out and I've just seen a message saying, can everyone see my screen okay? Sorry, just to interrupt myself. Jen or Matt, can you just confirm my screen can be seen okay? Yes, thank you very much. I'm not sharing the report in its totality. Thank you. I'm showing you some headlines from it. But absolutely, this is reflective of if you look at the report, these messages are absolutely emerging. And yeah, so geoeconomic is absolutely the top. State-based armed conflict was actually number one last year in last year's report. It's just gone down slightly, and just going down slightly there, extreme weather. Perhaps the only other things to particularly call out here are AI is absolutely coming into this list, into this top 10, and also cyber insecurity as well. So those showing up in the top 10 of the current global risks. And then what's really interesting is if we then look across the next couple of years. So as I said, the report always looks at the immediate term, but then it starts to project. So we're saying into 2028. So there is a bit of movement here in the listing. But I think what's interesting is the geo-economic confrontation is still very much at the top in the next 2 years. Growing concerns, trade policies, use of economic and political measures, sanctions, regulations, tariffs, as we know, supply chain challenges. Yes, countries using instruments to support this. And we'll come on to this, and Matt will certainly talk this, but I think it's really interesting to think about what that means for us, what that means at a local level in terms of those wider economic factors impacting on us. So yes, you can see over the next couple of years, you'll notice pollution comes in as well. So that's alongside extreme weather as a environmental risk, and migration also moving in the next couple of years. And then a really interesting picture is to think around the 10-year view. And so this is the report looks to 2036. And what's really interesting there is really the number of environmental risks that start to emerge in the 10-year view. Now, as someone who's been looking at this report year on year for a number of years, the comment I would make here is that I think when I first looked at this report, even back, almost 20 years ago, the environmental picture was absolutely showing up as a future risk. And it seems to, with regularity each year, it seems to be something that we're always looking at in terms of future. And I guess we will get to the point, if we're not already there, where it won't be 10 years, it will be 5 years, 2 years immediate. And the one you probably call out, obviously, is the extreme weather, which it features on the current one and in 10 years. But you can see the other environmental risks that start to emerge over the 10 years, the biodiversity loss, the changes to our systems, the natural resource shortages, the pollution. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a moment around, well, what does that mean for us? The other one, just to note, I think, over 10 years is the constant appearance of the AI and cyber insecurity. Clearly, big challenges, technological risk, certainly headlining in the longer term. And I think what you also have to look at next 10 years is the fact that these are risks, but what do they mean in practical terms for us? And that can absolutely the interconnections. A final comment before I move on from this one is the comment was made to me, well, 10 years, okay, that's 2036. That's actually not that far away, realistically. If you think about what's happened in the last 10 years, we go back to 2016. So really not that far. But even if you went up to 2050 and beyond, you're not talking about huge amounts of time. So, these risks are, ever present and perhaps ever nearer in terms of when we're doing a horizon scanning and thinking around the future. So what we wanted to do, sorry, before I move on to the public sector view, just to particularly highlight the global risks moving longer term. I think I've already sort of said this already, but the extreme weather events and the technological risks emerging over the next 10 years. And what we wanted to do is to think around, well, so what does this mean for us? And as Jen's rightly said at the start, I think that the challenge with this type of work is it can feel somewhat distant, perhaps more theoretical, more longer term, more global, but actually what does that mean in the real world? And how does that affect the way we look at our plans, the way we look at our risks, the way we manage moving forward? And we've picked three of the trends that we think are absolutely worth focusing in on in a little bit more detail. The one I'm going to pick up to begin with is the climate, the environmental risks. And then Matt is going to talk a bit more to the economic and the technological. So those areas as the ones we see as a sort of real big picture, key areas of risk moving forward. And the point that in terms of the environmental risk, the point that the report makes is that the non-environmental risks are starting to be a little bit more in the shorter term prioritized. But actually over the longer term, the environmental risks start to emerge again. So we really can't get away from them. They are absolutely there on the horizon. And just to give you some headlines from the report, a little bit more detailed here. So the UN Environment Programme's emissions gap report estimating a rise in global temperatures to exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels within the coming decade. So absolutely rising temperatures. And looking in the news recently, I think this has had some prominence around the the sheer strain on our power sources of new technologies. And there you go, in 2030, 35 data centers on their own could consume up to 20% of electricity, placing considerable strain. So there's the technology link in there with environment. And of course, this is very much within the news in terms of energy funding, energy growth, and where is the new energies, and perhaps a move slightly away from clean energy funding, but a focus on traditional fossil fuels, but also renewables to boost supply. So lots being done to look at where the next power sources are coming from. But absolutely power is something we cannot necessarily just take for granted. Something that we need to think about in the longer term. I mean, where are we going to source as our demands just increase? And yet we also are trying to balance the environmental risk. So what does this mean for us, for public sector? And the thing I've really called out here, and it's something of course we can see happening in the day-to-day, is the extreme weather, placing potential huge stress on our communities, on our infrastructure, on our budgets. And so we're already seeing this, of course, and what would have been events that may have been one-off, may have been fairly rare. To be honest, we're seeing them now on a day-to-day basis, or certainly an annual basis in terms of the number of weather events. And of course, we're directly seeing just the impact that has on cost, on being able to respond effectively to the outcomes of those events, the disruption that they cause, the public health challenges that are caused by them, the pressures on budgets and resources. And when you look at the numbers, it is quite amazing in terms of the amount of resources that are having to be diverted to dealing with these events. And they're certainly not going away. They are becoming more regular. And the question, I guess, there is, if we're having to invest more in this, where is that coming from? What gives? What are we having to take money from to be able to respond to the outcomes of these types of events? So I think there's some real interesting questions and increasing challenges that we face, and this isn't necessarily just in the next 10 years. This is really now, isn't it? This is almost an immediate risk. And the considerations are, well, are we doing the testing? Do we understand the types of impacts these events are going to have? I know myself, I've been working with a number of authorities looking at response to major weather incidents and what that means from an emergency planning and a business continuity angle. But I think, yes, you can have that immediate response, but clearly there is the longer term. Okay, we can deal with the here and the now in terms of how this has affected us, but there are longer term impacts on our communities. So are we building resilience into our planning and our budget models? Are we able to adapt our service delivery to adjust to the storms, to the extreme snow conditions, to the sheer wet conditions, the rain, heavy raining, the flooding risk that comes with that? Are we able to adapt effectively? And how do we manage the costs around that? And clearly, the adaptation to this isn't just for ourselves as organisations. I think what's also really interesting, and again, another connection here, is with our partners, with our suppliers, with the other organisations we rely upon, that we work with. How are they impacted? What are the costs that they incur? And what does that mean in terms of the services that they can provide to us or the services we provide to them? So I would say in the global risk report, we see environmental risk slightly coming down in the short term, but going up longer term. But I think we see it as absolutely an area that needs consideration. And if you're doing that horizon scanning, if you're doing that thinking forward and thinking about the risks that you have to deal with, I think it absolutely has to be on your radar, and not just looking at the environmental impact, but the sheer interconnections with other risk areas. And speaking of which, I'll hand over to Matt to pick up the topics around technology and economic risk. Matt.
Thank you, Phil. And good morning, everybody. Before I do jump into the tech risks, I'll just sort of introduce myself, as Phil alluded to earlier on. So, working the same team as Phil, part of the risk and resilience team at Zurich Resilience Solutions. I'm not quite as long in the tooth as Phil in terms of my Zurich career. I've been here nearly 10 years. But prior to that, I was public sector, and so can sort of relate, and I can empathise with a number of you probably on the call. And my career in risk probably stretches getting on for 20 years now, I think, if I think about it in too much detail. And like Phil, trying to bring our own experiences and our own understanding of what we see happening at a local level, and what organizations like yourselves are feeling and dealing with, and almost linking those back into that picture, as Phil's already touched upon with the environmental. And I'm going to try and run us through technology, and particularly around cyber and some of the elements connected to cyber, and then we'll look at the economics before trying to leave you with some helpful ideas, thought processes, or really building on what Phil's already picked on and alluded to. What I will say, and I think a question may have already come in, which is great. I'll just a quick shout out to remind people, any questions that you've got that you want to ask, please feel free to stick it in the Q&A function. There is a bit of time at the end where Jen and Phil and myself will coordinate those. Anyway, so moving us on. As it says around this on this slide, technological advances are creating opportunities and they are creating benefits, and many organizations are realizing some of those benefits, whether it's from ChatGPT sorting out your home life and decorating your house in a way that you may wish, or whether it's something a little bit more appropriate to the working context. But those benefits do also have a degree of a trade-off, and they are potentially bringing in some risks and some concerns for us at a local level. And as Phil alluded to at the start, some of these risks 10 years ago were being talked about, but they now feel much closer to home and much more like they're almost embedded into what we are doing and living and experiencing. And one of the things that I've perhaps noticed and seen in recent times, and hopefully this resonates with a number of you, is technological risks have been talked about on a global point for probably over 10 years if we go back through some of those earlier editions of this report. And they've appeared very consistently in sort of short and long term. And there's this year, misinformation, disinformation is in there at the second one. Insecurities in the top 10. We've seen an increase in the AI driven disruption. And the point sort of towards the bottom there is, for me, this is the key point of this slide, and certainly something that's resonated with me as I've done a lot of work with organizations, many of which you represent on the call. These are not what you would describe as being an operational IT department risk. All of those risks, actually, in my mind, they relate back to governance structures, they relate back to service delivery and finance elements. Phil's already talked about how the finances underpin the environmental element, but they have absolutely an equal underpinning of technology. And I think for organizations and public sector organizations, it's actually, we need to recognize that technology risks are no longer about system uptime and keeping systems in place and available. Actually, the converse of those systems going down impacts how our organization is perceived by our public, by our communities in which we operate and which we serve in. That in turn impacts the resilience of the organization, and wider, if you scale it up, you can even go into the roots of impacts on local community from a social point of view and the stability of those local communities. So the impacts are very much far reaching, and they can be derived out of something that may have historically been perceived as, oh, that's the IT department's problem to fix, or their ideas to resolve and to move us through. And actually, what it does show is, and what my our interpretation shows is that cyber insecurity and the way that technology is embedded into all of our organizations is persistent in its threat, because it does underpin so much of what we do. And a couple of examples on there, and I'm sure there may be some people on the call who've had, your organizations have experienced your own issues with regards to IT, whether they have been things like ransomware, whether it's been data breaches, whether it's been hacks. There's obviously high profile ones that were in the news last year of a number of organizations, and they were more private sector organizations that were documented in the news. The advantage, in a way, that the private sector has over ourselves in the public sector is they can potentially pause operations. We don't have that luxury in the public sector of being able to say, okay, we'll stop doing X because we need to try and solve the problem. The reality in the public sector is we need to continue to deliver those critical services. And so when we suffer ransomware or data breaches or any of the other types of variations, the impact that we're seeing on our services is potentially quite a significant disruption, whether that's front of house, whether it's even further out into the organization. There's a likely financial element associated to it, whether that is recovery of data and putting things right, whether it's future changes around insurance excesses and etc. etc. But for me, some of the elements that I think are often overlooked, and I say this with some degree of confidence of working with organisations, is how that impacts on reputation of the organisation into the community, and that confidence is something that I think is really quite key, that we don't overlook and we don't sort of almost discredit as an opportunity to make sure that we are looking at the risk in its entirety. And that's the sort of threat, and some of that is a very external threat. We can't, as organizations and individuals, we can't change that external threat, but we can look at, well, why do we think we are potentially vulnerable within the organization? And I think for me, some of the reasons as to why technology jumps out in public sector is we are still seeing a widespread integration of legacy systems on networks, and that vulnerability of those legacy systems, they're not as well supported, they don't have the same sort of locks and controls on them. We've already talked about how budgets are tight, and they're continuing to be tight. This is all impacting on our ability to then get new systems in place and replace those legacy systems. But it also impacts on just daily upgrades or patches and things like that. I know within Zurich we have logging off every day, turning your machine down because it's overnight that those IT patches are issued out onto systems, and making sure that that is something that's appropriate and available to all staff to ensure that our network remains as tight and as controlled as it can be. And as we are continuing to work in a more remote environment, making sure that our habits and our processes are as integrated and as well embedded as they could be. Another reason for the why, and it's shown on the screen around the sort of cyber talent, that's public and private sector. There is a talent shortage, and how do we attract the right people into the organisation that can help us and can support us? And another one that's come to mind, and it was actually when Phil was talking about the sort of the network of organisations that we work with, and Phil was obviously talking about it from an environmental point of view, but that network of suppliers and key providers and supporters and delivery colleagues of other organisations into our own network presents additional vulnerabilities when it comes to cyber. Those are new front doors that we need to make sure are as secure as they can be, and that they are meeting our own problems. And that last line that's shown just above the picture there on the slide of cyber risk, for me, is now very much a resilience issue, and organizations need to think of cyber and its threat on the organization's resilience, not just as being, oh, it's an IT issue, it's with the IT department, because it underpins so much of what we do. And I wanted to, similar to what Phil did with environment, start to think about, well, what does the future possibly look like, and what are some of the emerging risks that we may see in the next, I've said 5 to 10 years. It possibly could be shorter. It could even be a little bit further away than that. Misinformation's been prevalent in recent years, and it started some years ago with things like fake news and that terminology being utilised. But I think we're likely to see, what's referred to there as sort of deep fakes of officials and fabrication of instances. I know claims handlers within Zurich are already, they're picking the bones between fake images of claims that are coming through and pictures that have been run through various sort of channels to increase the appearance of the damage that's created and therefore inflate the claim to it. So we're already seeing instances of those deep fakes. But what if that goes down the route of deep fake of quite senior officials, prime ministers, mayors, etc., suddenly appearing in ways, and many local authorities will be facing elections in local elections in May. The way that misinformation could quite easily spread in those areas, I think, is quite scary, particularly on the sort of the volatility of the community in which that they operate in and how that could impact, and particularly if those messages actually could be AI generated, they could be impersonation of an individual, and very much manipulating that evidence. And as I've put on there, public trust can become very, very fragile, particularly when it's difficult for us to understand, is this a real or is this artificial? And very often the differences are quite subtle. So what is it we need to do? How do we sort of tackle this as risk leaders within the public sector? And again, this is building on some of the things Phil's already alluded to. For me, we need to make sure that risk discussions are occurring around technological elements. We don't just want a technology risk that sits on a register that might sit at a lower level. We need to understand how that technology risk is interconnected within all those other areas. Phil used that phrase around interconnectivity of risk, and it screams out loud within this year's global risk report, and has done for a number of years. Scenario testing is a really interesting one. We've seen organisations that historically you may have been involved in things like business continuity testing, and the example earlier around environmental is a really useful example. We've seen an increase recently of business continuity tests around cyber. In this instance, perhaps what I'm also alluding to is stress testing your risk registers. If risk A on your register happens, what does that then mean, and how does it impact the other risks within your register, B, C, D, etc.? And having those sorts of conversations elevates your risk discussion above and beyond the narrative of let's line by line, let's go through this. And we've all been in those meetings where that risk discussion can lose energy as you go forwards, because it becomes something quite commonplace. And then lastly, I've just stuck in something there around AI governance frameworks. Started this by saying technology does present opportunities for us, and we want to harness those opportunities, particularly when resources are stretched in the way that they are. It's just making sure that we have very key and very well established principles in place before we look to scale the use of that AI across the organisation. So again, just be mindful of the governance elements to it. And then I suppose what I wanted to just allude to here is, in terms of those future risks, we don't want to slow the pace of innovation. The public sector is often the one that's sort of hit with the proverbial stick to say, oh, we're always slow to react, and we're not the first, and we're not, it's not effective, etc. Where those opportunities exist, we want to harness them as best we can, but we want to make sure it's done in the right way. And I've put a few sort of points on there of rather than are we adapting fast enough? Actually, should we be asking? And this is on us, I think, as risk professionals within those group meetings. Are we governing this as well enough as what we can be? And what more do we need to do? What confidence do we need to have around how that whole process is managed, and realise those benefits that are shown on there? So that's technology. I want to then kick us into economic elements of this, and then, like I say, there's a couple of bits that we'll leave you with, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So economic confrontation has sort of jumped right up from being in the top 10 to now sitting at the top 1, and public sector economics has been something that we've all lived and breathed for a long period of time, and it's now just become the normal. What was once sort of had various other fancy names about them and elements to it, we're now just seeing this as, it's just public sector finances. No one's got any money, and the demands are outstripping it. And that service demand not being in line with what's available to us is the reality that many of us are continuing to live with. As it says on there in recent reports, we've seen short, medium-term threats around downturn, inflation, debt crisis, etc., and again, linking it back to what Phil said at the start. These risks 5-10 years ago were being talked about and probably felt quite close then. They certainly feel very close for us now. And I think in the public sector, it's realising and recognising that those risks are having a direct impact on our service demand, on our revenue stability, and our ability to invest going forwards. I was only talking to an organisation yesterday, and they were saying about how they were a housing organisation. They were talking about retrofitting in properties, and they were saying the problem we've got is we haven't got the money to invest in future ways of generating additional income, because we've got the sort of need to retrofit what we've got, but we need the money to do both. And we got into a sort of chicken and egg type conversation of, which one do we do first and how do we approach it? And those decisions, I think, are replicated across many organisations up and down the country, and across the sector, whereby you're having to balance a very fine amount of available resources. And those conditions that we're all working within, ultimately they are shaping what is realistically deliverable, but set against a backdrop of fluctuating change. Changes in local elections even could bring shifts in corporate policies and demands on our time and expectations, and indeed demands on what the public are wanting and trying to expect it. What I've tried to do is just have a little look around, a couple of current risks, or a current risk rather, around inflation cost, and just break that down a little bit more. Had a look around emerging risks, and then sort of trying to get us into, so what can we do? So when I talk about inflation and cost volatility here, what I'm certainly seeing is, for many organisations, the income that we're generating isn't flexing at the same pace at the costs that we're experiencing, and some of those costs are really volatile to external market conditions. We've seen energy costs, we've seen construction costs, we've seen the other ones that are shown on the screen there. We've probably all lived and felt those in the last few years. The reality that then brings, or the impact that's sort of bringing on our own budgets, our own organisations, is we might be having to make difficult decisions around what we do maintain now. I mentioned the housing organisation earlier on, and they are having that conversation. What do we do? What do we not do? What's our future look like? It could mean that you're having contract negotiations with providers at any level, or indeed facing the really difficult decision of trying where possible to reduce some discretionary services to free up that budget elsewhere. And that's really difficult, because those discretionary services ultimately are having an impact on what they're providing, which may in turn lead to a bigger problem further down the line, because those services, if they stop doing something, you start getting people with, greater problems, greater issues coming back to the organisation further on, or going to another part of the public sector, further increasing the demand on those services. So it's a really, really difficult and challenging balancing act. But the conversation needs to be one that we are involved in, and risk individuals need to be very much involved in. Just touching on that middle column there, a couple of emerging risks. So how do we take something like global economic fragmentation? What on earth does that mean to us? Well, for me, in reality, this means we're seeing an increase in procurement costs. We're seeing supply chains that have been impacted, delayed. There's reduced competition, so we're going out to the market, and we're what used to be quite an affluent market with a number of potential providers. Actually, it's now one or two people, and you're ending up, that reduction in competition is having a direct impact on the cost to it. Social inequalities on there, and I think many of us have, if we've not experienced it, we've seen it on the news around how social unrest and those community tensions, what that then means in terms of people coming through the organisation of increased demands or increased requirements on them. Again, I think these are things that we've all seen and experienced. The trend suggests that that's going to continue, and I think the trend analysis is something that's really quite key to understand for all organisations, of not just where we are now or where we have been, but what is that story suggesting that we can that we are likely to experience. And that last point that sort of perhaps showing on there around, so what can we do now? What does this mean for us? And I think, like all risks, albeit this one relating into finance, but actually AN risk could be substituted in there. What we want to see is those functions, and in this case finance functions, are working much more closely with risk functions. Risk isn't just an admin type activity where we have to tick the box from a compliance point of view. Actually, we need to be having far more detailed conversations around our future resilience planning, and what does this look like, and what's our modeling looking like, or future demand forecasting. What are those scenarios telling us, and what if that does occur or gets progressively worse? Like I say, making sure that proximity between finance and our colleagues in risk, and colleagues of ourselves, are ultimately what we're wanting to build those bridges with. So I've got a couple slides that kind of try and wrap us up, and then we'll open up the questions for the last 10 minutes. First and foremost, risks are increasing in their complexity, and they are increasing in the way that they are connected to each other and all parts of the organization. We are very much moving away from this sort of historic siloed approach to risks, and as part of that, we want to ensure that we try and focus on patterns. Historically, you'll have had risk managers who talk about, risk is trying to predict the future, and it's trying to guess what could come and what could disrupt us. We're now in a position where we've got lots of historic data to be able to lean on that give us patterns and give us that ability to focus on those and better think about what the future can be. I've talked there around, or put up around, asking better questions, and then within those bubbles beneath, I've kind of thrown a couple of those questions in there, and the reason for that is uncertainty, I think, becomes a lot more manageable when we're trying to understand in a bit more detail what it is that we want to understand. So those questions around, well, what this event, this scenario that we think could happen, what if this were to happen for a prolonged period of time? I've said 5 years there. Going back to some of the climate stuff, those 1 in 20-year events are now looking like 1 in 5 or maybe every year type events. What do we do? How does that impact us, and what is it changing, and what are we looking to change as part of our own organisation and indeed our future planning? And then using scenarios to test those assumptions. I've leaned on that already. I'll not override that particular point, but the benefit that they provide, I think, is quite clear for all of us. And then final slide before throwing it back to you, Jen, to see if we've got some questions. But I think there's some practical actions that I can share with you here. So particularly around strategy and governance. Talked about stress testing those strategic priorities. Actually, what happens if they are disrupted in any way? How does that work? And are our risk registers, our risk processes, are they aligned into those plans that we have across the organisation? And are they talking to financial plans, and are they talking to all those other parts of the organisation that they need to? And what you're trying to do is build in that uncertainty, but making it more visible. And certainly when it comes to decision-making papers, cabinet reports or whatever it might be within your own organisation, that goes through into board and goes through for review and for consideration, we need to make sure that risk is not buried somewhere in the report, but let's really put the spotlight on it. And that will in turn, will help give us some of the benefits that are shown in that middle box around making, better articulated risks. We've all probably been in those meetings. Certainly Phil and I will have seen those risk registers that are very long in nature, and they kind of read as sort of a list of all the bad things that could happen in the world. Actually, we want to focus on, we think this is a problem because of X, and making sure that we have a regular review of our risks, and making sure that review is has got key stakeholders in place, and they're all contributing the right way, rather than I mentioned rather flippantly the sort of line by line thing that can get a little bit tedious and can lose a little bit of energy, and you end up with just a compliance exercise for your risk register rather than something meaningful. And then lastly, the sort of final column that's shown on there, when it comes to business continuity, and I think risk and business continuity are kind of like the two sides of the same coin, and how we build those processes and make them a little bit closer, to make sure that we can plan for what could happen and plan for the disruption and plan for the change. Recognise we don't need to plan for perfection. We want a framework that supports us rather than trying to identify everything that could possibly go wrong. We want, key actionable traits that we can utilise. And key to that is making sure that we understand what are our minimum service levels. What realistically can we operate in? We all, everyone is important, and we all want to make sure that we're available when we need to. But how do we build that into how we look and how we operate? Jen, I think that is the content that Phil and I have got. I will throw it to you in case there's any questions to pick up.
Brilliant. Thank you both for that. That was super, super interesting. And I think really highlights the importance and the influence that actually risk and insurance managers should play in their organisations as well. We do have some questions that have been coming in. For the first one, I feel we may be slightly limited as to the extent we can answer, but I didn't want to just dismiss it and go by it without acknowledging it. So, a question come through from Claire, and there's already some chat and stats from James in the chat there. But how much impact and influence does the UK have on environmental risks compared to the rest of the world? So, Matt, Phil, I appreciate we might not have stats to support, but is there anything you want to comment on?
Yeah, Jen, if I pick that one, I've read the chat and I would agree with the comments that have been made in the chat. I think you have to look also when you research this. It's yes, there's the internal footprint, but there's the global footprint of the UK, and there's no neat figure as far as I know that tells you exactly the global footprint, but it's not, it's pretty big. So yes, I wouldn't disagree with anything in the chat, but I think you have to look at the broader global perspective of the UK's footprint, and clearly what we're talking about here is we know for whatever reason the environmental risks are there, and it's how we then are prepared for respond to the outcome, the impacts of them.
Brilliant, thank you, Phil. So next question, how should we be looking to evolve our risk management response to these increasingly complex risks?
Do this one, Phil, since you did the last. And I think we've perhaps touched on this a little bit already during the session that we've done. Historically, risk, the role of the risk manager and the way that risk registers were presented were perhaps something as part of a quarterly governance exercise, and perhaps a degree of compliance around it. We have to have a risk register, therefore we do have a risk register, and it goes through this process, and it doesn't necessarily tell us anything, or it doesn't necessarily support decision making, but we've got it. We've satisfied that box. I believe that approach is a sort of base level of where we want organizations to be. You need to have that process, and we do need to tick that box, and it does need to happen. But actually, we want to encourage organizations to move towards having risk that is more of a dynamic process, and how it then supports sort of horizon scanning and working its way into decision making, and how do we build those links between what are the future planning risks, and actually what's the vision of the organization. We all work with, within our organizations, we'll have corporate plans and corporate strategies that may stretch beyond 5, 10, 15 years, and they themselves go beyond electoral changes and fluctuations, and we need to understand risk needs to be involved in that conversation. So that I think is where the role of the risk manager could evolve and could change to allow that complexity of risk to be a little bit more understood, rather than, like I say, a sort of tick box line by line, but actually let's build those interconnections that are quite clear within our organization.
Brilliant, thank you, Matt. And I suppose the more complex risks are, the more complex the asks of a risk manager needs to be. I know we've talked a lot about soft skills and the ability to facilitate some of those discussions at the top table as well. So even the asks on risk managers are changing along with the risks as well.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. So you've spoken about misinformation and the erosion of public trust. So Matt, I don't know if I'm aiming this at you because I know these were on your slides, but how does this affect public sector governance and risk?
I don't remember picking that up. Actually, give Matt a rate, just because I've just been thinking. I think this is a really, really interesting question, and we could spend an hour discussing just this topic. So I'm not sure we can do it justice in a few minutes, but it's a really good question. I think it all comes down to so I think in the first instance, we can see this as a risk area, misinformation and lack of trust. We mentioned it in the global risk report. So what does that mean for us in the way that we govern our organisations? We know it's there. So how do we ensure that we address concerns around it? And that is how, it could be topics like transparency. How do we ensure there's an awareness and understanding of how we are governed, how decisions are being made, reports, etc. What's in the public realm? How do we manage that? A really interesting one, and we haven't got enough time to do it justice here, but that sense of, do we publish our risk register? But then if we do publish our risk register, do people properly understand the conversations that have gone on to create that register? So I guess the key point here is, do we take account of it as an area of risk in the way that we operate? And are we proactive? Do we almost predict the potential challenges we might face, and therefore counter those before they occur? Are we in a sense upfront with the way that we govern our organisations, and particularly the risks that we identify and how we manage the risks? But it's absolutely an ongoing conversation. Matt, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. So I jumped in there.
No, I appreciate the jumping in, Phil. And I agree with all that you've said. I think, perhaps one of the things I would say, and I work with an organisation. What am I trying to say? Reputational risk is where I'm going with it, and the reputational impact on that sort of lack of transparency and things. And historically, and I've perhaps viewed reputation risk somewhat naively as do you know what, it's difficult to manage because it's kind of a byproduct of everything else that we do as an organisation. But I've seen recently where some organisations, rightly or wrongly, have had their reputation impacted negatively, and they are now experiencing difficulty of attracting the right staff into the organisation because the perception of the organisation is one that either isn't transparent or, for whatever reason has sort of suffered that reputational impact. And I think it comes back to all of that, and how we're perceived in the community and in the sort of operating world in which we're in is really, really key. And transparency is an absolutely vital part of it, of making sure that we are demonstrating our worth to the organisation and indeed the community in which we serve.
Thank you both. We have got 2 minutes left, so I'll make this the last question. So there's lots of questions in there. So we've talked about having a dynamic process, ongoing conversations. Phil, you just mentioned. So is there a recommended process for having a dynamic review of risks rather than just an annual refresh?
I go, and Phil, by all means, sort of jump in and add. Is there a recommend? As a minimum, we need risks should be reviewed within the sort of governance structure of the organisation. Risk professionals will often talk about a pyramid type structure and how corporate risks sort of drive a review within the layers of the organisation. And good practice within, Orange Book and various other things that you want to have use as a reference point, we'll talk about having a quarterly review. For me, absolutely they are needed, but it's the power of that conversation. Is that risk register going and it's just, a discussion, or let's have a look at lines 1, 2, and 3, and then we've run out of time because the meeting has run over? Or are we actually having deep dives into individual risks and actually understanding what is going on here and what's the true root cause of that risk? And I think supported by annual reviews around what is our horizon, what does our risk horizon look like, and genuinely look like, and not just the next 12 months. And I think for public sector organisations, it's been very difficult to look beyond a 6 to 12 month horizon, but we need to push because we've got plans that stretch 5-10 years maybe in some organisations. So building all of that information in to have a more complete and holistic conversation, I think, is vital. Phil, I jumped in. Don't know what you think.
No, I agree with all of that, Matt. The one perhaps small comment I'd make is I sometimes see the risk register review right at the very bottom of an agenda meeting agenda, given 5 minutes, and it just doesn't do it justice. And I think that's the challenge of any risk manager, is how you move it up the agenda, how you bring it to life, and how you make it feel like these are important topics that need addressing. So yeah, give it if you can, give it more than 5 minutes at the end of a long agenda would be my comment.
Thank you both. We are at time, so huge thank you both to Phil and Matt for that really interesting insight. Just a reminder, this will be shared via a link in YouTube afterwards, but thank you all for your time today, and thank you for dialing in.